Good morning, and welcome to day 2 of the Virtual Victoria Forum. I'm Saul Klein, Chair of the Victoria Forum and Dean of the Gustafson School of Business at the University of Victoria. Bonjour à tous. Bienvenue à la deuxième journée du Forum virtuel de Victoria. Je m'appelle Saul Klein et je suis président du Forum de Victoria. For those of you who were able to join us yesterday, welcome back. I hope you found the discussions interesting and engaging, and we have another great day of roundtables scheduled for today. Once again, I'm coming to you from the University of Victoria and acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. I ask you to acknowledge the traditional territory that you are on today as we engage in our discussions. It is with gratitude that I introduce Dr. Skip Dick from the Songhees Nation to welcome us to the territory. He is an elder in residence at the First People's House at UVic and an honorand of the university.
Hello, my friends. My name is Lechi Chillock. I'm from the Coast Salish Nation, from the Lekwungen people, from the Lower Island. And on the island, we have the West Coast Nuu-chah-nulth nations, and on the north of the island are the Kwakala people. But what I really want to do is make sure that anyone that's coming to our nation that is first-timers, that they feel that welcome. So I want to say Haishka for being here, and welcome to our nation, Haishka. Welcome to all those attending the Victoria Forum presented by the Gustafson School of Business and the Senate of Canada. I look forward to sharing the good news of the conference. Haishka.
Thank you, Dr. Dick. Haishka. And now welcome to the plenary session, Constructing a Different and Inclusive Development Paradigm in Response to COVID-19. The Search for Transformative Solutions. I'd like to introduce Dr. Adele Gutuni to begin this plenary session. Adele is Associate Professor of Management Science, Operations Research and Decision Support Systems at the Gustafson School. And more importantly for today, is Associate Co-Chair of the Victoria Forum and the real visionary behind this initiative. Adele, over to you.
Thank you, Saul. It's it's a teamwork, so I really appreciate these words. It is with great pleasure and honor that I introduce to you this outstanding plenary on constructing a different and inclusive development paradigm in response to the COVID-19, the search for transformative solutions. C'est avec grand plaisir et honneur que je vous présente la plénière exceptionnelle sur la construction d'un paradigme de développement différent et inclusif en réponse au COVID-19, la recherche de solutions transformatives. I am Adele Gutuni, as Saul said. I am the Associate Co-Chair for the Victoria Forum, and I had the pleasure to work with all the panelists and the champions putting together the program over the last number of months. So at the Victoria Forum, we are working hard to address the 3 divides: the economy, society, and environment. However, we believe that the relationships of these divides is a matter of existence and not trade-offs. A prosperous economy exists in a happy society, and that a happy society or community cannot survive without a healthy planet. Je suis Adele Gutuni, je suis le associé président du Forum de Victoria. Au Forum de Victoria, tout comme nous travaillons très sérieusement sur des solutions et des idées pour combler les 3 clivages de notre temps: l'économie, la société et l'environnement. Cependant, nous pensons que les relations entre ces divisions et ces clivages ne sont pas des questions de compromis, mais ce sont des questions d'existence. Une économie prospère ne peut exister que dans une société heureuse, et que des communautés heureuses ne peuvent survivre sans une planète saine et dans un environnement sain. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce Crystal Tremblay, who's going to be introducing the panel and the moderator. Crystal is University of Victoria Community Engagement Star. Crystal Tremblay est la star de l'engagement communautaire à l'Université de Victoria. She is a social geographer and community-based scholar with interest in the areas of environmental sustainability, participatory resource governance, and critical pedagogy. In her capacity as special advisor...
Sorry, I missed that. Could you say it again, please?
Sorry. In her capacity as special advisor in community engagement scholarship, she provides leadership and research in support of the University of Victoria Community Engagement Portfolio. I wish you a very productive conversation. Je souhaite une discussion très productive. Crystal, over to you.
Good morning. Bonjour. Thank you, Saul and Adele and Skip, for the very warm welcome. And I'd also like to acknowledge with respect the traditional territories of the Songhees, Esquimalt, and WSÁNEĆ peoples. It is a pleasure to be with you today and to provide some brief comments on the social divide stream, which I co-chair with Peter Taylor with the Institute of Development Studies. The global pandemic of COVID-19 is a health and broader crisis of overwhelming proportions. It is threatening livelihoods, economies, and societies, particularly those already experience the greatest vulnerabilities. It is putting the lives of millions of people at risk and creating huge uncertainties and anxieties. Reactions to the pandemic are exposing and potentially deepening foundational cracks in society, heightening fragilities, exacerbating inequalities, and deepening vulnerabilities in systems of all kinds. The impact is playing out at local, national, and global scales via an interconnected world where a virus knows no boundaries. It has become a truly global challenge. But crisis also brings opportunity. And in addition to short and midterm adaptations and responses, this is a time to explore and work towards a genuine transformation of ideas, policies, programs, and practices. This may all be encapsulated in the overall notion of building back a better world, or as some are suggesting, building forward differently. In this light, we are seeing responses from governments, citizens, young and old, the private sector, and a range of societal actors. We are reminded constantly in public messaging that COVID-19 is a challenge that affects everyone, everywhere. And when it comes to knowledge and evidence, COVID-19 requires funders, researchers, and practitioners alike to reposition themselves in response to the pandemic if we are really going to see progress that is genuinely transformational. In thinking collectively about a new and better path forward, I'm reminded that while we reach one hand to the stars, we must also reach to the soil so that our solutions are grounded in people's lived experience, stories, and worldviews. Thank you, and many thanks to our speakers today. Peter?
Thank you, Crystal, for those introductory words. And thanks from me also to the Victoria Forum for hosting this plenary session today. I'm Peter Taylor. I'm Director of Research at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex in the UK. And hello, good morning, bonjour, and good afternoon or good evening to wherever you may be today. It's really a privilege for us at the Institute of Development Studies to be partnering with the University of Victoria in this important strand of the Victoria Forum on social divides. And as Adele said, we see these as connecting very strongly to the economic and environmental conversations as well. Now, this plenary session brings together a group of speakers who will provide different insights on how the pandemic is influencing policy issues that go beyond health, but which are all deeply connected with health outcomes. And we want to consider ways in which these priorities can be addressed by different strategies. We decided in this session quite intentionally to bring together different policy issues. This might seem a bit unusual or even ambitious, but we see these issues as highly interconnected with multiple intersections. So a key question for us today is how we can build forward differently on these issues through different but related approaches in ways that are joined up, that are grounded in evidence, and also that are informed by practical experiences on the ground. And we're going to hear that today from our speakers. And I'd just like to introduce them and welcome them. Mary McCarthy was recently appointed Nutrition Lead in the Development Cooperation and Africa Division of Ireland's Department of Foreign Affairs. She previously led the Research and Learning portfolio within DFA and has played a key role in a recent collaboration between IrishAid and IDS, which has focused particularly on issues relating to health, food, social protection, gender and governance in the light of COVID-19. We're grateful for IrishAid's support for this work, and that's the basis for some of the insights we'll share today in the panel. Mary has 18 years' experience as a specialist in education and global citizenship policy and practice, both in Ireland and overseas, including serving on a number of national boards. Our second speaker will be Rachel Sabates-Wheeler, a development economist with over 20 years of experience working in areas of rural development, institutional analysis, and social protection. She's a professorial fellow at IDS and a co-director of the Centre for Social Protection. Rachel's work continues to cover areas of poverty and vulnerability research and social safety nets for vulnerable groups with a focus on the rural sector. Our third speaker will be Sohaila Nazneen, a feminist political economist and also a research fellow at IDS, where she leads work on gender, politics, and governance. Her research focuses on feminist movements, women's empowerment and leadership, and violence against women in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Sohaila has worked as a consultant for a number of major development agencies, designing gender and development interventions and conducting policy analysis. And our fourth speaker will be Manuel Balin, Director of the Institute for the Study of International Development and Associate Professor of Political Science and International Development at McGill University, Montreal, Canada. His research is on comparative politics with a regional focus in Latin America. He's particularly interested in issues of corruption and development, corruption scandals, political competition, media and politics, transparency and anti-corruption policies, and democracy and the rule of law. Those are our speakers, and after we've heard from each, we'll also hear from our discussant, Khalil Sharif. Khalil is CEO of Aga Khan Foundation Canada since 2005. He was previously with the Toronto office of McKinsey & Company, where he advised governments, financial institutions, and healthcare providers on strategy, organisation, and operational improvement. And he's cultivated his interest in international development and conflict resolution issues over many years through collaborations in North America, Africa, and with the UN. So in terms of our running order today, we'll be hearing first from our four panelists, followed by insights from our discussant. We'll then open the session to comments, questions, and insights by participants via the Q&A. And of course, finally, we'll also be hearing some reflections and conclusions from our distinguished guest, Lord Jack Mcconnell, who I will introduce then. So Mary, over to you.
Thank you so much, Peter, and everyone. Bonjour. I'm delighted to be joining you from the west coast of Ireland and to be sharing a couple of key insights from the Irish perspective on this exciting but very urgent topic of building forward better. It's evident, I think, that business as usual is not getting us to where we need to be. So I suppose the question I've been asking myself in preparation for this session is how do we change course collectively? And in particular, how do we tackle the fragmentation that has characterised so many development efforts to date, be they by donor governments or national governments or civil society organisations, etc. So I'd like to look a little bit at how Ireland is approaching transformative approaches and understanding them and putting them into practice, and look particularly at the food, nutrition, health nexus, and in particular ahead of next year, 2021, which is a particularly significant year around food systems. So we might go into the first slide, please, Dee, if we can. I think the best place to start in terms of how we are understanding the challenges that we currently face in terms of development is with Ireland's International Development Policy, A Better World, which was published last year. And this is an infographic which sort of summarises that policy. And I want to bring your attention to two kind of key areas of this. The first is the overarching ambition of the policy is to reach the furthest behind first. And this, of course, echoes the rallying cry of the SDGs to leave no one behind, but it goes a little further and is more deliberate in targeting those who are most marginalised, most vulnerable, most prone to shocks. and acknowledging that these people and communities may be found indeed in lower income countries, but also in middle income countries, and indeed in much wealthier countries as well. So I think it's acknowledging the breadth of marginalisation and where that can be found. And we're seeking to achieve this very lofty ambition through kind of 4 key policy priorities. I think the first thing I would say is, yes, this is a policy. So a policy is words on paper. It's not action. But if it's one thing this year has really shown us, it's that our words really matter. And our statements of intent do matter. I think many people on this call, in this webinar, we might all perhaps hold a similar or a different worldview, but we would assume the importance that we attach to things like the economy, the society and our environment being holistic and considered holistically. But we can't take those views for granted, and we can't take support for fundamental agendas for granted. So statements of intent, and even more so if we can make these statements collectively as actors, they really matter. But how then do we transfer, like when we look at these lofty ambitions and then put them into some kind of tangible action? So I want to look at the bottom part of this infographic, the sort of the grey boxes at the bottom, which are not the what of this policy, but the how. And we might go to the next slide because they're a little bit more, they're a bit clearer in the next slide. So what we're the challenge we have set ourselves is really in how we utilise, we as Ireland, the tools at our disposal to have a greater impact and to be more focused in our work. So looking at our capacity, how we coordinate with others, how we utilise our positions of influence where possible and as strategically as possible. And also how we are ensuring that every position we adopt is underpinned by strong and robust evidence. And that was very much at the heart of the partnership Irish Aid has had with the IDS to date. And what's also missing on this slide is public engagement. How do we engage with domestic audiences and with audiences and stakeholders in other countries? The strength of our narrative, the strength of our evidence in telling our story and bringing others with us. So in terms of achieving transformation in a case like Ireland, we are a relatively small donor in monetary terms, but our size can occasionally be an advantage. So, for example, a small donor may be able to take risks that a large donor cannot. We've seen this, for example, in the area of community management of acute malnutrition, where Ireland really helped to pioneer that CMAM approach in community settings and then to bring that to scale. So recognising where we have strengths and then shoring up those weaknesses through collaboration with others is really, I think, at the heart of how we are conceptualising success. And if you could just go on to the next slide, please. If we're talking about building forward better, I wanted to look particularly at food systems, just very briefly. I think the whole idea of building forward recognises that what was there before was fundamentally not working well or was broken. And the global food system is a very clear example of that. It wasn't just a system that was not serving people and doesn't serve people now. It actively causes harm to people and to communities and therefore needs to be changed systemically. And one thing that we have noticed is that certainly in the COVID-19 response, obviously food systems are very much to the fore, but nutrition is perhaps not as central to that response as we might have assumed. So that food, nutrition and health nexus is really, to me and to us, really captures the breadth of what we need to be focusing on. All 17 SDGs to some extent rely on a well-functioning food system, on having a healthier, more sustainable and equitable food systems. So it's really, really central to the achievement of the 2030 agenda. And next year, 2021, is particularly important with the Food Systems Summit and Nutrition for Growth coming up. So with that in mind, what are a couple of key principles we can bear in mind in an effort to have greater and transformative impact? The first is that in all of our responses, even if they are kind of reacting to short-term issues, that we are seeking to lay the groundwork for longer-term impact. So we are strengthening systems to build resilience in our immediate response. Secondly, our capacity to speak with a collective voice, which is much harder to do than it sounds, and it requires ongoing relationship building and working through the multilateral system, which is now very much under threat. But the strength of our impact really does depend on how well we can speak with one voice, and that helps us to deal with the fragmentation I mentioned at the start. And we see this again, for example, in the nutrition community, where very often messages can be dispersed and fragmented in a way rather than bring them together in one compelling single message. And thirdly, the third principle is to localize and collaborate in all decisions we take. Context is everything, and that is not fixed, it is dynamic and constantly changing. So we need to listen to communities who we seek to serve and work with, and ensure that our decisions are informed not just by those who think like ourselves, but are also informed by voices from civil society, from grassroots, from private sector. A diversity of voices are constantly there so we can critique what we are doing, refine and get better. Peter, I think I've gone over my 7 minutes, so I'll pause there, but very happy to go into any other aspect in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Mary. No, it was perfect timing, and that's a really great start, helping us think through about issues relating broadly to a transformational process, but also giving us that focus in on food. I'd like to turn to Rachel now to help us think through some ideas around social protection.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Peter. It's great to be here today. I'm going to be talking about the critical role of social protection and the critical role that social protection can play in the current climate of COVID, post-COVID, and the challenges and opportunities we face. So social protection, for those of you who might not know, it refers to policies, programs, instruments that protect the vulnerable against negative outcomes from shocks, or even prevents negative outcomes from shocks. And we all need social protection against anticipated shocks. So for example, if I become unemployed tomorrow, I have unemployment benefit. If I get injured at work, I might have an injury insurance or a disability insurance. But there's also unanticipated shocks such as a tsunami or COVID-19. And we might need food, we might need cash, we might need shelter. So we all need social protection, but the most vulnerable to shocks are typically the most poor and the poorest of the poor, and those sort of concentrated in the poorest regions of the world, and therefore social protection is often focused on the poorest. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic has had far-reaching consequences for poverty and food security and livelihoods around the world, and it threatens to undo many decades of progress that we've made towards the global commitments against poverty reduction and elimination of hunger. And the number of people falling into extreme monetary poverty is projected, due to the pandemic, is projected to range from about 50 million to up to 400 million worldwide. And that rise in poverty is going to be even higher, because that's just monetary poverty. If you think of all the multidimensionality around poverty, it's probably going to be a lot higher than that. And as economies shrink, due to the recessions, the L-shaped recessions that we're going to enter, we're going to have less finances also for that, to help those big bulges of poverty. So social protection has an enormous role to play in this context. And in fact, social protection has been one of the most important short-term measures deployed by governments across the world to buffer their populations against the immediate impacts of COVID-19. That might come as a shock to some of you, but actually social protection has really scaled up. Typically, the provision of basic needs when you have an unanticipated shock like COVID would be met through the humanitarian response, humanitarian sector. But social protection is usually reserved for sort of longer term chronic problems, livelihood problems. But it's interesting that what we've seen in this pandemic is that the core response has been through the social protection sector and social protection systems. And just by July 2020, from the beginning of COVID, 200 countries had introduced more than 1,000 social protection measures in response to the pandemic. And the majority of those responses constituted some form of social assistance, like expanding the coverage or expanding the amount of payment people got. So child benefits might have gone up, or certain types of, generous furlough arrangements in order to expand coverage. And that's pretty incredible that social protection systems have been able to do that, because it's only due to recent work, the last few years, and innovations in social protection programs, that we've been able to use these systems to respond nimbly and flexibly to shocks. In fact, we place this within what we call shock responsive social protection. Shock responsive social protection is ensuring that you build social protection systems that, first of all, they're routine. They deliver to the poorest of the poor, the chronic poor, the people who are always going to need help, but they're also able to cope and flex and respond to demand following large-scale shocks. And the shock responsive social protection agenda brings together the humanitarian sector, disaster agencies, social welfare ministries. It's a really cross-sectoral initiative. And it's really, really critical that we build on what we've already been doing in the last few years and make sure that as the pandemic unfolds and sort of post-pandemic, we really invest in these systems. So while I've said social protection has been amazing in terms of responding, unfortunately, the global increase in social protection provision has been hugely uneven. The World Bank, Ugo Gentilini, has put out a lot of literature on this, evidence to show that obviously wealthier countries have been able to expand their social protection systems to scale much quicker and more easily than poorer countries. So even before the pandemic, approximately 55% of the world's population were not covered by any form of social protection. And the consequences of COVID-19 has actually exposed the fact that there's real weaknesses in systems in certain areas and regions of the world. And that's going to have devastating impacts for populations who are already furthest behind. So there's actually been an exposure because of the global nature of this shock that we can see where there's real weaknesses and real problems in fiscal capacity and just other technical capacity constraints, that we really need to start focusing on this as we move forward and start building back. So COVID has been a real wake-up call, alerting the global community to the urgency of accelerating progress in respect to building social protection systems. And I don't have time to talk about the nuts and bolts of those systems, but there's so much work and more work that needs to be done around targeting, delivery of social protection through digital technologies, setting up MIS systems, coordinating across sectors, and financing as well. So these are all huge areas I'd love to talk to some of you about at some point. And I just want to put out there that as attention shifts from addressing urgent humanitarian needs after the COVID crisis, it's really time for us to think about the role of social protection as part of a really long-term solution to living with COVID and living with all kinds of other shocks, so that we can really help support building back better or building forward better, however we'd like to put it. Okay, thanks, Peter.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Great. And it's really important to get that second perspective as another of these high priority issues, which I must say is getting increasing attention, rightly so. And now I'd like to move to our third presenter, Sohaila. And Sohaila, please share your thoughts with us on gender. And obviously, I think with knowing that there's quite a significant Canadian audience here too, Canada being one of the few countries in the world that has a feminist international assistance policy, it's really great to get your perceptions right now.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you to Victoria Forum. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us from. As you heard from Peter, I've been asked to make interventions thinking about how do we sustain gender equality in times of COVID-19. The key point that I will make here are two. One is we are at the risk of losing the gains we made around women's rights, but also gains we made in terms of women's well-being, in terms of access to health, economic participation, participation in decision-making, and also vulnerabilities that women face, not just in terms of economic vulnerabilities, but also violence that they face. So that has increased. So given that we are at the risk of losing the gains that we have made so far, how we respond as states, how we respond as policymakers, how we respond as practitioners matter, because that will shape whether we hold on to these or whether we lose it and we fall behind again. Having said that, obviously gender covers many different areas, and I can talk about it, but I have chosen 3 areas to focus on. And my focus is mainly on low and middle income countries in the global south, because you have to think about the nature of the state there. They lack capacity, there are lack of resources, there are issues around how these states are governed. So my focus is very solution oriented in terms of what should we be doing, including as a funder, what should Canada think about or want to promote in sort of the international arena or in their engagement with the global south. So the first area is around health. Obviously, with COVID-19, the focus has been on public health emergency and making sure we can track and trace and provide provide treatment for those who are sick, etc. But obviously, needs around sexual and reproductive health, so your need for contraception, your need for menstrual hygiene products, your need for abortion services, your need for maternal care does not go away. It's there. And how do you meet those? We need to think in terms of as funding, how you spend your healthcare funding. So the fundings that you have earmarked for SRHR or maternal healthcare needs to be ring-fenced. And you need to ensure that those programs are running as essential services, that they should be identified as essential services. The other thing that works quite a lot in Global South is the mobile clinics and the outreach programs that you have. That is what allows you to sort of provide services to the most disadvantaged, whether they're in remote areas or whether they are extremely poor. Obviously, COVID-19 poses a challenge in terms of infection, transmission, etc. But if you look at how community healthcare workers have been used to sort of get the message of COVID out, there's a need to think, how do you ensure their safety, but how do you also ensure service provision of these things happening? And what role can digital technology play there in terms of not just getting information out about treatment and services, but also what kind of what can be done around that? And there are some collaborations with private sectors around that, but perhaps that's something to look at and be scaled up. So that's one area. The second area is violence against women. We all know that rates of violence have gone up. You're in lockdown situation, in families, you cannot just leave. So that's domestic violence, but gender-based violence has also gone up in terms of human trafficking of girls or harmful practices around early child marriages happening because families are facing poverty, and also schools are closed as safe spaces. So there is an urgent need to focus on this area and ensure that women and girls are not vulnerable, and also boys. So one of the ways to think about is, how do you ensure that the justice system is working? What would digital technology play in terms of issuing injunctions or issuing court orders? How do you make it work? The second thing is to think about all the services that are provided to survivors of violence, healthcare, social care, and other legal aid. How do you ensure that those are running in a safe manner and that the funding is not cut? So obviously there's a need to invest funding there and continue with that. Apart from that, obviously, survivors of violence need shelter. Repurpose the empty spaces that you have there for creating those shelters. And lastly, if you're in a lockdown situation, locked with the perpetrator of violence, obviously you need creative ways of communicating. You can't just pick up the phone and call. So think about Ecuador, which introduced a system where you can send emojis, and certain emojis mean certain things. There are ways of getting around it. So think out of the box and scale those up. The last area that I want to focus on is economic recovery and rehabilitation. So key issue here is, of course, social protection that Rachel talked about, but it's about what kind of social protection, and focusing on it in terms of, think about women do most of the childcare, elderly care for the sick. So interventions in social protection need to focus on care. There are issues around providing targeted debt relief and credit relief to women entrepreneurs, women business owners, women farmers in the global south. And lastly, in terms of legal protection for workers, women working in the informal sector, think about the vendors, the waste pickers, the market sellers, they don't have all the kinds of legal protection that you have in formal sectors. So how do you ensure that they have that? And how do you ensure that not all women are fired from the formal sectors because they do care work? So in your response planning, think about that. So I'm going to end my intervention here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sohaila. So we've heard now three speakers, again, taking different policy areas, but all clearly interconnected. We've heard speaker after speaker referring to issues that others have also mentioned, whether it's around food equity or whether it's around social protection or whether it's around gender equality. So Manuel, I'd like to turn to you now, please, and to help us think through how are we going to actually support movement towards these when there are so many challenges around the governance of financial flows.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks for the invitation. It's really great to be around such distinguished and great speakers, so thank you all. Hi everybody, I should say. Bonjour à tout le monde. Hola a todos. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to talk about three main points here, right? I'm going to first try to share some thoughts on how we should understand this challenge that we're facing. Second, I'm going to try to address how we need to change how we think about our responses to this challenge. And the emphasis here is on how we think about this, talking about efficiency, about fragility, about robustness. And third, I'm going to share some thoughts on some policy implications for financing, for governance, and specifically for issues related to anti-corruption policy. So first, in terms of how we understand COVID-19 crisis, right? And we face sort of three main options given what we know about these crises, right? So some people think about this as an inflection point or a critical juncture where, things change and are set on a different path, right? We were on one path, this puts us on another one. A second option is to think about this as a period of exceptionality, akin to, a natural catastrophe where the regular procedures are suspended, and later, once the crisis is over, they're reinstated, right? Once normality is back. The third one, the third way of thinking about this crisis is as an accelerator. An accelerator means this position where there were changes that were previously quite incipient, but ongoing, and now we've hit fast forward. And I will argue here that we need to see this crisis as an accelerator, as this allows us to understand two really important characteristics of the challenge we're facing. So first is that it's not going away. And second, is that we should stop thinking about it as this unexpected thing, this black swan, a la Nassim Taleb, but rather we should start considering it as something that we could or should have expected, and that's something that may or will be repeated in the future in some shape or form. And here I'm thinking of two characteristics of the COVID pandemic that may be repeated. One is its exponential nature, which comes from a pattern of spread that it's linked to exceptionality, to super spreader events, and not to a norm of average contagion rates. And second, its intermittent wave-like nature, which is also connected to this and which we also think, I would argue, that we will see repeated, right? And so how does this need to reshape our understanding? Well, the pandemic has generated a set of subsequent and interconnected crises that are first and foremost a health crisis, second, an economic crisis, third, a social crisis, and fourth, a political crisis as well. And at the core of these lies the centrality of the state, of state capacity, which materializes in two very different ways, right? Two really distinct type of capacities. The capacity to dominate that we see sort of going up, to quash unrest, the use and threat of the use of violence on a negative side, and on the positive side, the capacity of the state to serve a population that is in growing need. So these comments are centered around the idea that the state is recovering centrality and will continue to do so for good reasons, the protection, and for not so good reasons, the quashing of unrest. So now in thinking about the role of the state, for decades, we focused on constructing more efficient states, right? And the problem here is that in striving for efficiency, we've created lots of fragility. The well-functioning of our systems, and in particular of our social protection systems, is dependent on each one of all the moving parts that make that social protection possible. So this means, in an efficient world, in a world where we are thinking about efficiency, that there is no room for excess, as this would mean inefficiency. Efficiency is good because, or so we hear, it's good because it implies achieving objectives, social protection, food security, health provision, at lower costs. But efficiency also means that we should live with one lung, fly with one turbine, because we don't need two. So why is it that I'm talking about this? I'm talking about this because the COVID-19 crisis has evidenced that we need inefficiency, we need redundancy, we need that inefficiency because it gives us robustness so that things can fail and we can still achieve social protection, we can still achieve objectives. And we want to ensure achieving these objectives, as a main role of the state. We want to achieve the provision of health services, food security, social protection. So the strength of a chain is given by its weakest link, not the strongest link. I heard people that are much smarter, better prepared than I say this, right? I can't take credit, but it makes a lot of sense, right? We need to focus on those weaker links in order to make the chain stronger. So this is something that is changing how we're thinking about supply chains, moving away from a world of competitive advantages. And it is something that we should also change in how we think about our social protection chains. Now, in concrete terms, what does this mean, right? These are ideas up in the air, of course, right? But how do we bring them down to reality, and how should these new ways of thinking about inefficiency as a positive thing affect concrete policy? So in broad terms, what this means is changing from a model of planification to a model of preparedness, of robustness. We need to duplicate. We need to construct 2 hospitals where one is needed. So think about it. This is not so crazy, right? Think about it. When it comes to defense, we overbuild tanks and weapons that we never use so that we can defeat any sort of hypothetical enemy. But with hospitals, we do the exact opposite. We go for efficiency. We build the bare minimum so that there are no empty beds in normal times. This needs to change. So what would be the message for governments, or my message at least for governments in terms of financing this? I point to 3 main messages here. And these are tentative messages that I'm happy to elaborate later. So first is we need more cooperation between governments and private sector on the provision of public goods, right? There's been collaboration, but we need collaboration on the provision of public goods such as health. Second, we need to reallocate spending in national budgets. We'll be facing an economic pandemic for years to come, and there needs to be changes in how we finance, how we allocate those finances. And relatedly, and really unpopularly in some circles, so bear with me here, we need to focus more on effective taxation of those currently avoiding paying their dues. And on this, I'd add an international aspect, and that we should use some of the technology used to address issues such as money laundering to address tax avoidance, and to think about taxes in a more progressive way. So now, final point, and getting finally to anti-corruption and governance policies. So I would argue here that we need to think about the potential losses to corruption, which is a great concern in development, right? It's a great concern in the provision of services. We need to think about those losses, the potential losses to acts of corruption, more in terms of their threat to efficacy, of actual delivery of services and social protection to the population, and less about it in terms of cost efficiency concerns. We need to pay more. Do we need to pay more to ensure efficacy, that delivery? Then so be it. Let's pay more. This is a departure in how we are used to thinking about corruption as purely sort of a cost-cutting issue. And for this, we need donors, funders, researchers, and practitioners to get on with a new way of thinking about governance, a new way of thinking about corruption concerns. It's not that corruption doesn't matter, but we should address corruption in line with its consequences on service delivery, on efficacy, and not in line with its consequences on costs, which is that efficiency idea. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manuel. You've all given us a lot of provocations. That's exactly what we wanted and what we'd asked for from our speakers today. And in a moment, I'm going to turn to Khalil to invite you to discuss what you've heard and to weigh in with your insights. Can I also invite participants, please, to pose your questions, your views, your comments? I'm sure you've heard some insights that either you agree with or that perhaps you would like to challenge or to query. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Please do take this opportunity to pose your questions because we will have time for some interaction with you all and the panelists in a few minutes. So whilst you're doing that, Khalil, let me turn to you and invite you to share your thoughts and reflections.
I usually start, Peter, with a sentiment of gratitude for being invited, but I have to say on this particular occasion, I feel no gratitude at all for the task that you have deposited upon me. It's almost criminal to ask me now to react and try to bring together such a rich and insightful discussion. But since we're live, I have no option but to discharge that responsibility, however inadequately I might do so. So let me, instead of thanking you, Peter, and the Victoria Forum, let me at least thank our panelists for giving us such a wide range of interesting thoughts to chew upon. Let me try to draw, as I say, however inadequately, 3 or 4 threads that I think unite some of the preoccupations here and maybe even suggest some areas of divergence. The first thing I would say is that it is clear from this discussion, and I think from our own intuitions, that the COVID crisis appears to us in masquerade. It appears to us disguised as a health crisis. But once the mask is lifted, what we see actually lurking behind that health crisis is actually a multi-dimensional crisis. It is a crisis that is an economic crisis. It is a crisis of governance. It is a crisis, an educational crisis, which we haven't actually talked about here. It is a gender crisis of significant and growing proportion. So we are confronted today with a multidimensional crisis. And the second thing about our current situation that I've taken from the discussion here is COVID is also represents, to use another metaphor, a spotlight or maybe even a floodlight that is bringing into sharp relief a series of fissures and cleavages and marginalizations, some of which we've known about for a long time, like gender, some of which we have known about but have chosen to ignore, and some of which, frankly, are coming into public and international consciousness for the first time. So in a sense, COVID is bringing us into intimate contact with ourselves. The mirror that it is holding up to us is both powerful and deep, and we are being called upon by this panel and by the crisis to confront, I think, the implications of this very stark mirror and to decide how and if we are going to respond. Let me say thirdly that I've also heard the crisis being characterized in different ways by our panelists. And maybe even let me try to invite a consideration of a potential divergence in views here. And I don't think it's a debate, but I do think it suggests the different areas of focus. I think COVID represents, if I can try to capture the sentiment of the panel, actually 2 opposing forces. There are forces of acceleration and forces of deceleration that we are confronting simultaneously. We are seeing actually decelerating progress in certain trends. We've talked about it with respect to poverty and the prevalence of absolute poverty in the world having been now effectively reversed stalled and now, I think, in stark reversal as a result of the crisis. We have heard that same sentiment in relation to gender equality, that certain gains that have been made over the last years and decades in gender equality are now being both stalled and maybe in free fall with respect to the crisis. So there are certain ways in which the crisis has decelerated progress. There are, of course, another set of opposing areas where we've seen certain kinds of acceleration of trends, including in the use of technologies, in perhaps accelerating certain dominating forces of the state, especially in more fragile societies. So COVID then represents two opposing forces simultaneously at play, certain things decelerating and certain things accelerating. Let me try to capture finally two areas where I think we have talked about the response. And the first thing we've been called to by the panel is to understand the differential impacts of COVID on different parts of our globe and our collective humanity. We've been asked to look at the fate of lower and middle income countries who are suffering through this in a very particular kind of way compared to the advanced North Atlantic democracies. We've been asked to look at the differential impacts by gender, and indeed by generation. That's been suggested, although not been called out specifically. We've been asked to look at the differential impacts for the poor. We've been asked to look at those who are furthest behind as bearing yet again the deepest consequences of the crisis. So the first part of the response thread I want to draw here is, I think, the universal call across the panelists to sort through how the COVID crisis has impacted different parts of our world in different ways, and a call, I think, to look at those who have been most made most vulnerable by the crisis. And finally, let me try to capture the sentiment of the importance for us to look at systems. We have heard again and again by the panelists how important basic systems have been to our ability to respond. Their presence has been a trampoline and a shield, and their absence has not only been a vulnerability, it's sometimes been a sword that has further attacked the most vulnerable. We've heard about food systems. We've heard about health systems, not only the crisis health response, but the way in which the crisis has shifted resources and attention and priorities away from the ongoing basic health systems in maternal child health, in sexual reproductive health. We've heard this in other settings around basic preventative and vaccinations. All those things have given way as we've focused on responding to the immediate health crisis. We've talked very extensively here about the social protection system as a response and where it has been present, how it's allowed societies to weather the storm of COVID, and where it has been absent, where people have fallen so severely behind. We've talked even today about taxation and about budgeting systems. The centrality of the state has been, I think, a constant theme throughout our conversations here today, and how much COVID has reminded us of these basic systems. Peter, let me try to capture two other sentiments in wrapping up. The first is a call for what I would say is bifocalism. We're being asked to look at the situation now with two lenses. One eye has to be focused on the immediate response, the immediate vulnerabilities, the immediate issues in front of us. But even while we are doing that, we're being called to take the other eye and to look to the future and to understand what it is now, as we're responding to the crisis, we can do to invest in the foundation stones for our long-term response. We've heard that in food systems when Mary talked about the idea of building today a long-term food system that addresses the nexus between nutrition, health, and food systems. Manuel has talked about the idea of rebuilding our systems with fat tails in mind, to use another Nassim Talebism, to say, look, we are in a situation where these kinds of redundancies now need to be reintroduced into our systems thinking. So what we're being asked to do is to look at the crisis with bifocal vision, one eye squarely focused on the immediate vulnerabilities and responses required, especially for the most vulnerable, but a second eye now looking at responding to those crises and those immediate needs in a way that allows us to build back to a longer term posture. Finally, let me simply say that I think we've spent too much time talking about government in this panel today. That for most of humanity, in fact, it is still the case that their governments are the last institution that they can draw upon for aid, especially in times of crisis. That in fact, who they turn to are their neighbors, are their communities, are civil society, and even the commercial private sector. That a large portion of humanity is still marginalized from the umbrella of protection of their governments, either because the governments are weak and still building their own capacity, or because their governments are frankly not friendly at all to the most vulnerable. So I appreciate and even laud the panel's focus on the fundamental public systems that the COVID crisis is exposing as fragile, weak, and critical in so many parts of the world. But governments alone will not respond to this crisis, and governments alone will not drive the betterment of the fate of most of humanity who is now struggling with this crisis. And I think we have to now reckon also with our vision for a far more institutionally pluralist posture to responding to the crisis, one that recognizes the centrality of government and the state, absolutely, but also recognizes that for the vast majority of humanity, I still think it will be the case that at least in the near to medium term, the prospects for successful democratic governance are still very, very low. And the role of non-governmental parties, civil society, community, individual households, and the commercial private sector will continue to have a massive, massive influence on the fate of humanity. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, Khalil. And you said we were posing you a challenge at the beginning, which perhaps was going beyond the bounds of reasonableness, but I somehow thought that you would be exactly the person who'd be able to navigate through all of that. So thank you so much. And I'm still thinking about the bifocal approach, which is an expression I'm going to take away from this particular discussion today and keep pondering on it. I'd like to now continue following your really excellent points in the discussion, Khalil, by turning to our participants, and we've got some really great questions appearing in the Q&A. So I'm going to pick up some of these, and I'm going to ask our speakers to respond to some of these. So I'll just try to do a little bit of bringing together of some of the ideas which are included in there. And actually, the first point that did come up in the Q&A was about pluralism. It's almost as though that person read your mind at the end there, Khalil, saying that pluralism is a vital and existential for development and change. So what role does pluralism play? And I think you've actually begun to speak about that a little bit. But the second part of the question is around also to something you've just said, what is the role of local communities? So, if we understand that local communities should be included in all aspects of development, from planning to programs, such as are being suggested in this conversation, how do we go about doing that? And there's a specific question to Mary, actually, on Irish Aid, which is an interesting one, which I'll just flag. And that is saying that in terms of engaging civil society beneficiaries and other local stakeholders involved in the delivery of aid, that also involves bringing the public on board, engaging with citizens, having them, engaging and supporting. And the question, is there wide public support for Irish Aid for increasing public expenditures abroad in times of COVID? which I think is an interesting question. And I'd also like to bring another couple of questions in, and then we'll get the panel to respond. One is really around the fact that there are a lot of agreements that have been made. The SDGs, commitment, 2030, zero poverty, zero hunger, and major changes in the world that we see today. But what has actually moved in terms of progress towards that? Are we really going to see the progress that we want to see? And is COVID going to, essentially throw out those pathways and those journeys so that some of those things that you've been talking about today, whether it's governance or social protection, gender equality, or equitable food systems, what's going to be the impact on our ability to deliver on those promises? And then another question which relates to that as well is, are the fundamental models which underpin our understanding of how we'll get there, are they still working? Is the pandemic basically disrupting the fundamental models that we have been understanding for some time about how we get towards the destination that we, most countries in the world have laid out by 2030? Do we need to revisit some of those? And it sounds from your insights that you do think that would be the case, but I would really like to get some of your views on some of these points first of all. So Mary, if I could turn to you. There was a specific interest in Ireland's approach to this, but then I'll turn to others as well for their views.
Great, thanks, Peter, and thanks also for the questions. On the kind of the public engagement side, I think in answer to your question straight away, currently public support in Ireland for our official development assistance is relatively high, and it ranks relatively high and has remained at that level for quite a stable period of time. But we're always very conscious of our nearest neighbour in the UK, where aid in particular has become far more politicized and has been under attack, and where public support has fallen. So I don't think we can be in any way complacent around kind of our understanding of aid, and beyond that, really our understanding of, it's not just about aid, about global citizenship. I think it's that underlying message that our lives are deeply interconnected, and the actions that we take have an impact on others, even if we can't see it or feel it. And that's why I think the approach that we have taken has very much focused on some outreach in communities, yes, but more focused on our formal education system. So embedding global citizenship education into our curriculum, but also in our initial teacher education, because we have found that even with the opportunities in the curriculum to really discuss difficult issues of power, of racism, of colonialism, of politics, you need to have a very skilled teacher and somebody who's able to manage a multicultural classroom. So that's where a lot of our focus on what we formerly called development education, and now termed global citizenship education, has focused. So it's in trying to embed it in the curriculum and building the capacities of teachers to then work with students. However, the majority of students will learn most at home and with their parents and with their primary caregivers. So I think we could do a lot more in terms of our outreach. But we're caught, I think, and it's a dynamic that I think others will understand and share. We're always under pressure to tell the good news story, either the bad news story to generate some kind of momentum and response, or the good news story to say, look, this is a very linear process. We did this and we've had this result. This is great. It should carry on. And I think we need to be a bit braver about how we engage with the public, about the complexity of what we're doing, how it is anything but linear. It's a cyclical process. And in many cases, just remaining present in a country and building relationships at multiple levels, not just with partner governments, as Halil has pointed out so eloquently, but at multiple levels in civil society, with communities, with different voices. And being there over a long period of time gives you credibility, and it builds trust, so that when a crisis does hit, you are maybe in a position to be of some assistance, or to understand, or to do something that's necessary. So I think it's about conveying that long, hard, frustrating work of diplomacy and of building relationships in order to have an impact. I hope that's not too long-winded an answer.
Oh, great, Mary. Thanks very much. Let me turn to Rachel, and perhaps you have some thoughts to share, which speaks to this issue about how to engage communities. And there's also a comment that's come up, or a question, a comment that's come up in the chat about how to hold countries that have made promises, to actually deliver on things to those promises, and to ensure that things which were said that were going to happen don't just simply get reneged upon, either because of COVID or simply because it's kind of convenient just to backtrack and not to deliver on promises that were made. So, Rachel, thoughts from you on some of these points?
Yeah, I mean, I can give some thoughts. I hope they're helpful just to get some more discussion going, people thinking. So someone earlier, you were talking about the role of local communities. Well, in social protection, of course, I haven't really talked about it today in 7 minutes, but in every other crisis we've had, financial crisis or any other crisis in the past, so local, non-formal types of social protection are so critical to support families, to support vulnerable groups. Rotating savings, loans, funeral burial societies in Ghana, all of these things, very local level, non-public. But I think there is a case to be made that in some places they're kind of stretched to the limit. Pastoralist communities in Ethiopia, Kenya, they have very strong clan-based forms of social protection where they, even if they're given a formal provision from WFP in terms of food, they will share it across the community. So really fantastic sharing, but still keeping them in very, that form of sharing doesn't allow people to build up enough assets to move out because they're kind of stuck in a subsistence poverty trap almost. So there is definitely a role, whether it's government, private, NGOs, global, some kind of thinking around how do you support communities. Maybe we shouldn't have a focus just on individuals and households. We think, what's the unit of analysis we should be supporting here? Maybe it's a whole village, maybe it's a community, maybe it's a clan. I mean, one thing that's quite specific about this COVID crisis in terms of social protection is the restrictions on movement. Which often migration is a classic social protection coping mechanism. People will migrate as a form of social protection, and in order to get resources to send home to provide people with an income stream or education or health. And a lot of restrictions on movements due to this specific health shock has meant that avenue is not necessarily open for people anymore. So we're seeing certain forms of informal coping mechanisms or social protection being really restricted, and that's worrying. And value chains are being disrupted, food supply chains highly disrupted, so people can no longer use those. So that's one comment. The other one was on the SDG commitments. Yes, I think, poverty, in my presentation I said, the data shows poverty is definitely increasing globally because of the COVID pandemic, and for sure it's going to impact the progress we were making in the SDGs. I mean, maybe someone will disagree with me, but I think particularly in sub-Saharan Africa where I work, the SDGs very unlikely to be met at a regional level, maybe in some countries. But I imagine the good thing is there is a lot of learning, particularly in some of these social, where I work, systems around social protection. There's a lot of learning that's happened. There's a lot of new technologies that hopefully, even though we might sort of have gone back a little bit or quite a lot, until we can hopefully keep things going. We don't have so much learning to do. We can take what we've learned from the past and hopefully move things quicker this time. But yeah, I would think these SDGs, it's going to be tricky to meet them. That's all I've got to at the moment.
Thanks, Rachel. So Hila, let me turn to you, and I'm just going to throw in another question as well that's come through, and you may want to sort of just adapt your answer. I realize I'm kind of getting everybody to adapt in real time here. But one of the questions that's come through, and I think it does connect to the other points, is that in many countries, especially those that are experiencing severe disruption, it's very difficult to know where to prioritize first. There are breakdowns in health. There may be increasing, cases, incidences of violence against women. There may be shortages of food that people are experiencing. How do countries go about making choices about what to prioritize? And we have another person who's shared an experience of suffering from a debilitating disease, waiting for essential treatment, but that treatment or prognosis has been deprioritized because of COVID. And then, someone in that situation may experience disabilities for potentially lifelong disability because of not receiving the care that they need at a particular time. And I'm asking you this because you emphasized very much on care as opposed to welfare. If we want to provide care that's needed, how do countries go about prioritizing?
Peter, really? How many minutes do I have? Having said that, and this is something that's happening in real time, so you're not going to have a perfect answer. One of the things to think about, and of course this is putting on my political scientist hat, and it's not going to make you happy, is that each country has a different kind of capacity in terms of basic systems, right? And what your system looks like. That's your precondition in terms of, do you have the required staff? Have you invested in the infrastructure? How quickly can you mobilize? Even in crisis, when you're facing crisis, a country that's middle income with certain kind of established healthcare structure to deliver at the community level will tackle it very differently than if you're starting in a country which is very much conflict affected and you have no structures at all. So it's sort of starting with that, looking at what's your precondition like and where can you maximize and what's the, where are you most weak and what do you need to do? Obviously, as you face a crisis, the humanitarian sort of sector, it's like immediate response. I need to feed people. I need to make sure that these people have houses, or I need to vaccinate them. That's one aspect. So the thing is, as Khalil was talking about, we talked about immediate responses in terms of what needs to be done immediately for, let's say, you need to track, trace affected population, what's happening. You need to ensure food is there. That's one aspect. And then, but there's also the long-term lens of where do you want to go with it. So there are the issues about coordination and planning. So your response then needs to think, what are the immediate urgency and what can wait a little bit, depending on what kind of resource, what kind of capacity, what do you have. So there are going to be, and this I'm going to be the bearer of bad news, there are going to be some trade-offs. But at the same time, the question for you to think about is, what are the trade-offs that you can live with and what would have very, very debilitating impacts, not just in the short run, but also in the long run. So certain choices will need to be made, but at the same time, as you're making choices in the short run, doesn't mean that you just drop it in the long run and you don't respond to it ever again. It will come up. So there are ways of trying to think about what kind of fragility do you face. Now, having said that, this is where then I'll try to link it to the second question, which I wanted to raise in my presentation. We are used to the debate of welfare state and how much welfare, who do we cover? And then it's almost sort of, even when we have enshrined in all our constitutions and everything else, that this is people are equal and there are certain rights that we believe as rights, we still look down and we think that is charity and handout and etc. That lens doesn't work. But it doesn't work because your lens, it's not what, I mean, I agree with Khalil, community is important, civil society is important, but your relationship or your claim on your community is very different from how you claim as a citizen on a state, what the state is responsible for. Then thinking about how do we create not just states, but how do we create entities where your main lens is about care. So that's what sustains the economy. That's what sustains the society. So in terms of provision of services, if you're in let's say a national health services, that's a welfare service, obviously then prioritization would happen. This is what emergency health needs are, rest of them wait. If you have a lens that is about how do you provide care. So it's not just about how do you provide emergency services, but how do you ensure that people who are the most vulnerable, living with disability or elderly, or who are in care homes, or vulnerable populations that have care needs, how would you respond to that? Then it's not just a cost-benefit analysis. It's a different kind of analysis in terms of how do you then roll out the services and how do you ensure that the services are accessible. So that debate then changes because you're not just doing economic calculations or what you can afford, because ultimately human life is, how do you put a price on that? I may sound idealist, but if you are going to rebuild, and this is a moment in history, how we react will decide, you can make changes. In that sense, we have a chance as a generation. How do we take it is up to us.
Thanks, Sohaila. And well done for dealing with complex questions and also giving us a really inspirational close there. Manuel, let me turn to you. In addition, please respond as you wish to the other questions, but also there's a question if you could expand a little more on the idea of looking at anti-corruption differently. And also there's a comment there that corruption and greed is something which really manifests in ways which has direct impact on individual people's lives. They feel it because healthcare systems don't necessarily work. Some of the challenges that we've just been talking about, where in order to achieve that care may basically be interfered with because of corruption and greed in the wider system. Can you share just at least briefly a little bit more of your thoughts about that?
Yeah, sure. I should preface by saying that I specialize on easy questions, so this will be a challenge. The three main points that I wanted to elaborate. The first one has, when I talk about thinking about efficacy and not efficiency, this is related to the anti-corruption question, right? And so we care many times in our design systems about achieving the objectives with the least amount of resources possible, right? And so this generates sort of a lean system that has no excess. And we care about corruption because corruption is seen as excess. It's seen as extra cost that is added onto the system. Now, what I'm saying and what I'm proposing here is that, if really efficient systems are not robust, that any single point in the chain may make the system fall. And so we need to build in redundancy and we need to build in sort of duplication in order to have resilience be possible. And this, in many cases, may be seen as, encouraging corruption because it's inefficient. And I want to resist that. I know what I want to say is that we need to think about corruption in terms of the cost it generates on the service provision side more than on the dollars put in by the funder, right? It's not that I don't care about your dollars. I care about your dollars, but I care more about whether the services are being provided or not. That is the change in discourse that I'm proposing there. That's one point. The second point has to do with something that Khalil said about the role of government. And I want to respond because I want to resist a little bit. I agree with you, Khalil. But I'm not ready to let go of the idea of the centrality of governments here. I agree with you that you need to go beyond that. It's governments with, it's not governments by themselves. But I deeply think that the only truly sustainable solution to these problems that governments have not been able to solve includes governments. It's not without those, right, that we need to think about this. And so I do want to bring back governments front and center here. The last point that I'll make really quickly, something that Sohaila also talked about, what do governments in the Global South do? And I don't know. That's the first answer. That's a really hard question. So thanks, Sohaila, for helping us think about this. But the second thing is I've been observing this, and I'm from Argentina, and Argentina is facing a number of different challenges on a number of different ways. And I've been trying to wrap around my mind around how do we go about thinking about these things, right? And I think part of the problem is the transitions between the different issues, right? So you're stuck in the immediate, urgency of it all, and you can't think long term, right? And so when and how do we make the transition from an ongoing crisis to something that will be sustained in time? Because our responses here will not help us long time. It will just be like patchwork. And so I think the really difficult part of this question is how do we build transitions between the different levels at which the problem is operating? And I think in the Global South, or at least in Argentina that I know best, and in many places in South America that I know best, we are stuck in one level and we can't sort of move past it. And I think that's more of a question than an answer, but that is how I see it. And this is what's really worrying and frustrating to me.
Thank you so much, Manuel. So we're almost drawing to a close, but I just wanted to come back to Mary just with one question that was there. And it was this question about how to really engage between governments or between agencies. And, we're hearing more and more discussion again now about the importance of multilateralism. Could you just give us a really quick sense from Ireland's perspective? What are you learning about that, and what do you think are the potential ways forward to really promote this idea of collaboration that can bring about change? And I'll just ask you to be fairly brief, but any quick insights on that would be really great.
Yeah, being brief about multilateralism is tricky. It's hard. I think I will say. I think in this year in particular, and the last number of years, Ireland has really pushed to be a staunch defender of multilateralism, and sometimes by just doing very basic things. So retaining open communication, reiterating positions, holding language. I think, and very often we've seen progress, particularly, for example, around language around sexual reproductive health and rights. Just getting that language maintained, and not having that slip. Around global compacts and so on has been a huge piece of work, and that I think comes back to my earlier intervention about progress and development. Sometimes just being able to hold ground is a success, and not slipping further is a success. I think. And picking up on what's been said about governments as well. I mean, governments are probably the last are not leaders. They follow. They follow what's happening. We're not typically innovators. Bureaucracies don't typically innovate. They will kind of they will lag behind and pick up ideas and then run with them, because it seems they eventually see which way the wind is blowing. I think on the multilateral stage, and particularly now, and I'm only allowed to mention this now because we're in Canada, with the Security Council seat, I think what we're very keen to do with that, and what we have undertaken to do with that seat, is to be a voice for other, particularly small island developing states and other nations without a voice on that seat. And that comes with a very heavy responsibility, and one which we take very, very seriously. So it's about using the opportunities, I think, ethically and in a smart way. And I can't be any faster than that. Sorry, Peter.
Thank you, Mary. That was great. And thank you to all of our speakers. There were more questions and comments, and it will be great to cover even more. But I think we'll keep the ideas that we shared live, and I'm sure that these conversations are going to continue. So I would just like to close now by welcoming and introducing our speaker for some closing remarks. Lord Jack Mcconnell was First Minister of Scotland from 2001 to 2007. From 1999 to 2011, he was a member of the Scottish Parliament and held several key leadership positions within government. He served as UK Special Representative for Peacebuilding from 2008 to 2010, when he was appointed to the House of Lords. And he's currently co-chair of the UK All-Party Parliamentary Group on the UN Global Goals for Sustainable Development, Vice President of UNICEF UK, and the chair of the Mcconnell International Foundation. He's also a member of a number of boards in the public, charitable and private sectors, and is also an extremely strong advocate for sport, particularly in Scotland. So I should just say also congratulations on Scotland's advance into the Euros from last night.
It's nice to have a little miracle at the end of a difficult year. And there's big celebrations in Scotland today. There are already speculation that there'll be many babies in Scotland next year called David Marshall, the goalkeeper who saved the penalty last night. Thank you very much for this honour and trying to sum up such a wide-ranging discussion. Excellent contributions opening up, and then really interesting answers to the questions that were posed about what are clearly huge issues, as I think at least one of the contributors made clear at the beginning, that have been exposed by, not created by, the pandemic this year. These, I think it was described as was it Khalid who said, fissures and cleavages and marginalisations that the pandemic has shown a floodlight on, rather than created, should be getting our attention long before we enter 2021. I thought the speakers all made really interesting points, and perhaps would highlight from that Sahila's demand that we think out of the box. Manuel saying we must look at corruption and its impact on people, not just on finance. Rachel, despairing, I think, at the lack of preparedness for the shocks and the impact that then has on people and social protection. And I thought inspirational, really, from Mary, not just that diagram from Ireland that has the SDGs right at the very centre of the potential of the system, but I thought, also, Mary, your really serious points about the need for us to be honest in this argument, to explain that development and change is long term; it's not short term, and we need to stick at it. I wanted, I suppose, really to make 3 points, if that's possible, just in trying to maybe give people things to think about, particularly if you're in Canada and you've got a day ahead of you, as opposed to those of us who are about to enjoy our Friday nights. The first of those is, I think I believe very strongly that one of the reasons for the rise of the nationalist populist movements around the world that have in many ways damaged some of these initiatives that we've been debating here today, and strong ideas for progress, is a real complacency on the part of those who are in positions of responsibility around the world but don't think that way. And I think we need to shake ourselves out of that complacency. We need to be bold and clear that fundamental, sustainable change is only possible within systems that embrace democracy, transparency, proper independent rule of law, and fundamental equalities, in particular around gender. And I think sometimes we backed off from that argument. There's been a little bit too much respect for those that don't accept that. And I think we need to win that argument and win it everywhere. And if we're going to have proper, sustainable development that is actually serving everybody, and in particular in serving those that are most marginalised. The second thing I wanted to say is that I'm actually very angry this year. I mean, it's hard to express in this sort of forum just how angry I have felt. We have known for a very long time that this pandemic was coming. We've experienced the economic shocks around 2008. We've known that over these years, in this decade and the next in particular, we're going to experience climate shocks, that individual countries, individual places around the world experience extreme weather shocks. And what have we done to build resilience into the systems and into government and into communities and into people's lives to help them cope with this shock, which was perhaps the most predictable and specific of all? And I think this year, if it's shown anything, it's shown just how short-term and how lacking in resilience our efforts have been globally over the past 2 decades. And we should all be very angry about that, all accept some responsibility, but we should feel angry and feel a sense of urgency in being and helping people, not just us, but people, be better prepared for the future. And on that point, I wanted to just say that we do have an answer here. The Sustainable Development Goals, when they were agreed in 2015, if you go back and read the speeches that Amina Mohammed was making at the time after the consultation and in launching the 17 goals and the whole strategy, the comprehensive nature of the strategy, resilience was at the core of that. It was about progress. Yes, about bringing gender and peace and justice in institutions and the economic aspects into the debate that had been taking place the previous 15 years about the Millennium Development Goals. But it was also about resilience. It was about creating stronger communities, individuals who were more able to cope with the sort of shock that we've experienced this year. So I think we need to put, as the Irish I think have done, we need to put the SDGs at the absolute centre of our strategy, because they also force us to work together. The SDGs, if we focus absolutely on leaving no one behind, and that is our number one focus, and if we focus on bringing together the most relevant goals in any individual country or community, then we can use through the SDGs build better systems of cooperation. We can transform development. We can transform economies to make them more sustainable, and we can transform communities and people's lives. And if I have one message coming out of all this, when we look at the priorities and the behaviour and the decisions of international donors, when we look at the behaviour and the strategies or lack of them in national governments, in poor countries and in rich, and when we look at and I have to make this point, the culture and the behaviour of much of the NGO and maybe also possibly the academic sector as well, where people seek profile and for an advocacy for their own projects and positions, rather than necessarily for the good of the whole, then I think we all need to take a look at ourselves at the end of 2020. If we don't transform our own individual approaches and organisational approaches, we will not transform the whole, and we will not have the great phrase used at the beginning, build forward differently. We will not build forward differently. We'll just do more of the same, and we will fail when the next pandemic or the next climate shock, the next economic shock comes to hit the world.
Thank you so much, Lord Mcconnell. And it is, again, my pleasure to close this very interesting and exciting conversation. So thank you to the panel. Thank you to the champions. So Peter, Crystal, Khalil, Elisar. So for putting together this very interesting conversation with these different perspectives. So I would like to invite you in the next hour or so to network. So if you are interested, please log into VFair, and you will find actually in the networking section people who are really interested, in also networking with you. But in an hour from now, we have 5 very exciting roundtables. La première roundtable, la première table ronde, c'est sur le rôle des universités pour combler les clivages et les fractures socio-économiques et environnementales. The second roundtable is about how or can democracy work. The third one is about bridging social divides, decolonizing the knowledge for transformation. The fourth one is on civic leadership, citizenship, and participatory democracy, lessons from a global response to systematic racism. And the last one is about the 2020, is it the year of behavioral science and social relations? Then during lunchtime, our lunchtime, on the West Coast, so there will be a discussion about moving beyond the divides toward a more sustainable and fairer future for local communities and the global communities, which is actually built on a lot of what you heard in this plenary. And during our evening here on the West Coast, there will be a discussion about the impact of the post-US election debrief, change or continuing in a global affairs in Asia with an Asia perspective. So please continue to be engaged, continue to participate in these roundtables, and many of the roundtables are open for participants to be part of the conversation. So we invite you to join the conversation, and this ends this plenary session. Thank you. Merci.